Week 3 is officially here with the New York Jets taking down the New England Patriots on Thursday Night Football. Today, I got you guys covered with my top 36 wide receivers in the tier list format I give you guys every Friday, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my favorite flex plays. But going into the will they play tier, the general rule of thumb here is we want to see at least one practice going into the weekend, whether it's on Friday or Saturday. We want to hear the good reports going into the weekend. So again, monitor these guys' statuses. We're unsure if they're going to be playing. However, I will give you the full breakdown of what we know thus far. Justin Jefferson, wide receiver, Minnesota Vikings. Sounds like he's going to suit up. Again, he would be my wide receiver 3 overall if he is indeed playing in this game. Team has managed his practice workload coming off the quad injury he suffered last week. Sounds like a minor issue. Sounds like a load management issue. I do expect Justin Jefferson to play. And if, of course, you have him, he's going to be expected to be a high-end wide receiver 1 in your lineups. T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. My wide receiver 22 if he does go in this game. Only issue, it is on Monday Night Football. With T. Higgins, he hasn't made his season debut quite yet. Missed his week 1, misses week 2 with that hamstring injury he suffers. By all accounts, he is expecting to play in this game, has returned to practice. I do expect T. Higgins to play. Because it is Monday Night Football, make sure you are insured with a pivot option if T. Higgins doesn't go. Jaden Reed, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers. My tentative wide receiver 36 if he does go, because there's more context with Jaden Reed's situation compared to some of these other guys. Jaden Reed dealing with the calf issue. He was upgraded to limited in practice after a DNP on Wednesday. The only issue with Jaden Reed, of course, he is dealing with his calf injury, but more specifically is the health status of Jordan Love. If Jordan Love is healthy and Jaden Reed is playing in this game, Jaden Reed is a top 24 wide receiver for me. If Jordan Love is out and Jaden Reed plays in this game, he goes more so towards wide receiver 4 expectations. You'll know all of this info going into the weekend, but play Jaden Reed carefully. And then we'll go to the Chicago guys with Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen. We'll start off with Odunze. Does sound like a minor injury, the same knee issue he played through on Sunday Night Football, a game he played 96% of the Chicago Bears routes. I really have no concerns with Rome Odunze. Again, he's limited in practice. They're probably loading his management. They don't want to rush him back fully into that practice workload, especially knowing he played 96% of the routes on that hobbled knee. Again, sounds like he's going to be able to play. If he does play, I actually do think this is a potential breakout spot for him. He played 2 tough defenses in the first 2 weeks. He's still running 96% of this team's routes. And if Keenan Allen, like we'll get into in a second, is out of this game, I expect this Bears offense to look good sooner rather than later. They've played 2 tough defenses, a much easier defense on the docket this week with Indianapolis. So don't be shocked if this is actually the Rome Odunze breakout week. And then finally, Keenan Allen, the other wide receiver of the Chicago Bears, still dealing with that heel issue that he played through in week 1. He suffered it in the preseason, goes in week 1, less than 3 yards per target in that game, and then hasn't played a game since. He's missed practice all week. I'm really concerned if you have Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen is a guy to me that even once he comes back, are we sure he's going to be able to move properly coming off that heel injury? Again, it sounds like he's actually going to be out of this game as well, so monitor that. But moving forward, if you do have Keenan Allen, I am extremely worried about him. But now moving on to my top 12 wide receivers, we start off with my wide receiver 1 on the slate, CeeDee Lamb of the beloved Dallas Cowboys, 23.5 implied Cowboys points at home this week against the Baltimore Ravens. And CeeDee Lamb hasn't had his blow-up week yet. Obviously, he went probably top 2, top 3 in a lot of your drafts. Hasn't had, that week-winning 30-plus point performance quite yet. However, when we're looking at the context of the matchup, I really do think this is the blow-up spot for CeeDee Lamb. Again, 48-point over-under at home this week against Baltimore. And the Baltimore secondary just simply has not played well to start the season. We saw Devontae Adams have a very big game last week. We saw, of course, Rashee Rice have that big game on Thursday Night Football in the opening week of the season. I think this Baltimore defense can be had. CeeDee Lamb is, of course, the nucleus of this Cowboys passing offense. And with 23.5 implied points, I expect the Cowboys to be able to contend on offense, put up some points on the other end. And if that's going to be the case, CeeDee Lamb is going to be able to score a monster fantasy day. Receivers 2 and 8 respectively actually play against each other this week with Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions and Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Of course, the Lions implied for 27.25 points. The Cardinals implied for 24.25, Lions being 3-point favorites in this game. Amon-Ra St. Brown bounced back in a big way against Tampa Bay last week. Really saw that performance that we wanted to see. Obviously, week 1 kind of hampered in the production department. We did see him bounce back in full this past week. He checks every box you would want in this matchup. Highest implied team total of the slate, like I mentioned, at 27.25, and the highest set over-under of the week. Like I said, he bounced back in a big way. 35% target share in week 2. At the end of the day, although there is more target competition on the Detroit Lions now with Jameson Williams, with Jahmyr Gibbs, with, of course, Sam Laporta, Amon-Ra St. Brown is still the nucleus of this passing offense, and I expect him to continue piling 20-plus point level performances. On the flip side of the matchup, we saw Marvin Harrison Jr. have his breakout week last week. 4 catches, 130 yards, 2 touchdowns, including a big-time long touchdown in that game last week for the Arizona Cardinals against the Rams. He looks good. He looks like the top 5 pick that he was built to be. He looks like the number 1 wide receiver in the FSC prospect model. Now goes up against a Detroit secondary that has been had in the first 2 weeks. So I do think this can be a high-scoring game. I can see it being a 31-28, 30-27 type of game, and I want all pieces of this Detroit Lions-Cardinals game, but the main 2 that I want specifically are Marvin Harrison Jr. and are Amon-Ra St. Brown, my wide receivers 2 and 8 respectively. Wide receiver number 3, we have Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Texans implied for 24 points this week going up against the Minnesota Vikings, and not many were as high on Nico Collins coming into the season. He was one of my favorite picks in round 2 this year, and so far, so good, man. He's the wide receiver 2 in fantasy, 28% target share for a CJ Stroud Texans-led offense. I think the sky's the limit for CJ Stroud. Now, I do know and I do recognize that the Minnesota Vikings have been very good in terms of their defense so far this year, but Nico Collins is a different breed. I think Nico Collins is threatening to be a top 5 wide receiver talent in the league, and having insulation to a 24-point Houston Texans stud offense, I want all pieces of. Again, Nico Collins is the number 1 piece, reason why he's my number 3 wide receiver, but I'm willing to trust the Texans on a week-to-week basis. Wide receiver 4, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Monday Night Football game, of course, like I mentioned with T. Higgins, 26.75 implied Bengals points at home against the Washington Commanders. He hasn't had his blow-up game yet, but he's still a superstar talent. He's still attached to Joe Burrow, and Washington completely can't stop a nosebleed. They are the worst pass defense in the NFL thus far, the number 1 matchup on the matchup chart. If Jamar Chase is going to bounce back, it's going to be this week against that horrific secondary. And then wide receiver 5, we have Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. 25 implied points for the Niners this week, going on the road to play the Rams, despite missing a huge part of their offense. Christian McCaffrey obviously out for the long term. Deebo Samuel going to be out for this game. George Kittle ruled out. The last man standing at this point is Brandon Ayuk. And Brandon Ayuk, in my opinion, has superstar top 5, top 8 level wide receiver talent. And we know the insulation of the San Francisco 49ers offense. Kyle Shanahan is going to feed his best players. And without the other players being on the field, I do think Brandon Ayuk is in store for a monster bounce back performance. Hasn't been too productive in the first 2 weeks. I think this is the blow up game. With Brandon Ayuk, we can see 7 catches, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, and what should be a still highly functioning San Francisco offense, despite the losses of personnel they have. And I have Tyreek Hill at number 6. I really don't know what to do with him because on one hand, of course, he is arguably the best receiver talent in the NFL, 30% target share, explosive Dolphins offense. On the other hand, not having Tua Tagovailoa and having an 18.5 implied team total against a tough Seahawks defense on the road makes me very skeptical. Again, I think he, because he's so talented, has to be viewed as a mid to late range wide receiver 1, but I just don't know what to do with him. Again, he's got the talent to be able to be a top 5 wide receiver on a week-to-week basis, but the problem is I just don't trust the situation. There's a real possibility that Tyreek shows he's situation-proof and he's a top 3 guy rest away, or Tyreek Hill just shows he can't overcome this lack of an offense, and instead of being, the wide receiver 6 on the slate, ends up being a wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 type of guy moving forward. Wide receiver 7 for me is Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. 25 implied Chiefs points this week going on the road to play the Falcons. Rashee Rice has taken that second-year leap we were hoping to see going into the season. Rashee Rice is averaging 17.9 PPR points thus far on only 1 receiving touchdown. On top of that, the Chiefs have passed for less than 27 pass attempts per game in the first 2 games to start the season. With no Isaiah Pacheco, I do think this team leans more heavily on the pass. This is a team with Patrick Mahomes, with the weapons that they have, will want to pass the football in neutral game script situations moving forward. Instead of, 27, 28 pass attempts like they've been at in the last 2 games, I think we can see the Chiefs offense really go back up to the 35, 36, 37 attempt per game type of range. And if that's the case, if Rashee Rice is already giving you 17.9 points on low volume right now, just imagine what it's going to be when the offense as a whole actually does start throwing the ball more. Wide receiver 9, Devonta Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, 23.5 implied Eagles points this week on the road against the Saints. No A.J. Brown, and the Eagles have run at a much higher pace with Kellen Moore as the offensive coordinator to start the season. Smith has wide receiver 1 level talent, and we were always saying in the offseason, if A.J. Brown missed time, time, Devonta Smith would be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. He has versatility to play inside and out. He's the focal point of this passing offense. And I do think moving forward with A.J. Brown in the lineup, we can expect low-end wide receiver 1 numbers from Devonta Smith. My wide receiver 10 was Garrett Wilson, obviously played on Thursday Night Football. Kind of a mixed bag of a game. 9 targets, 5 receptions, 33 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown that really saved his day. 14.3 PPR points. He kind of just got blanketed by Christian Gonzalez all night. Still a solid game, like we said, but 33 receiving yards we want to see up moving forward. Defenses have played this Jets offense trying to take Garrett Wilson out of the game. I'm interested to see how the Jets bounce back knowing this moving forward. And then rapid fire, my wide receivers 11 and 12 respectively are Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Big time matchup at home against the Denver Broncos this week. And Malik Neighbors, wide receiver of the New York Giants, going to play the Cleveland Browns on the road. So we'll start off with Godwin. This Liam Cohen offense looks great. He's getting the Cooper Kupp role. We're seeing 58.2% of his sampled routes coming from the slot to start the year. I trust this offense. I think they're in a very insulated situation with what I've seen from Cohen thus far. And I do think with Pat Surtain most likely shadowing Mike Evans on the outside, this is the Chris Godwin eruption spot. Malik Neighbors, the fact that he's even in my top 12 just shows the level of talent we're dealing with. 64% target share in his second career NFL game against Washington last week. However, the Cleveland Browns defense is not the Washington defense. I do think he's a more volatile play, knowing that there's only 16 implied Giants points this week, but I'm honestly ready to just call Malik Neighbors the complete outlier. They scored 18 points last week, and this guy was a top 3 overall wide receiver on the slate. So with Malik Neighbors, he is the foundation of this Giants passing offense. It's not a very good offense, but Malik Neighbors is a legitimate 30+% target share player on any given week. And although the Browns defense is very good at limiting fantasy points, you can't go against this type of volume and this type of talent that Malik Neighbors possesses. But moving off of my wide receiver 1s, obviously in this video, I'll be talking about my top 36 wide receivers. Before we get into wide receivers 13 to 36, if you guys want access to the quarterbacks, running backs, full wide receiver list, tight ends list, along with Corey's rankings as well, the weekly rankings manifesto is for you. There is one of 2 ways you can access it right now. The first way is by going over to Underdog Fantasy and using promo code FSE. If you sign up and deposit at least $10, you will access our full weekly rankings manifesto throughout the rest of the season. The other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com, promo code FSE. You will get 30% off any package you want, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. If you're able to do that, you will get access to our full weekly rankings manifesto throughout the entirety of the rest of the season. But like I alluded to, let's go on to the high-end wide receiver 2, starting off with Chris Olave as my wide receiver 13 on the slate. I just mentioned his counterpart with Devonta Smith. Big-time pivotal matchup in the NFC with the Saints taking on the Philadelphia Eagles at home. 26 implied points for the Saints this week, and Chris Olave has just been the unluckiest wide receiver in the NFL thus far. With how the Saints offense has looked, we would have expected more production from Chris Olave in the first 2 weeks. That hasn't really happened yet. However, what that does tell me is that Chris Olave is due for a monster performance, specifically against an Eagles defense that has seeded big plays so far this year. The Eagles defense is actually one of the highest in terms of cover 3 usage, according to Jacob Gibbs. And Chris Olave beats cover 3 at a top 5 rate in terms of targets per route run, the 5th highest targets per route run in the NFL against cover 3 defense. We know Vic Fangio with the Eagles will run a cover 3 base, and I expect Chris Olave to absolutely feast and get back on track this week. Wide receiver 14, Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders, 22.5 implied Raiders points this week at home against the Carolina Panthers. The Raiders offense hasn't been a complete train wreck like I would have expected coming into the season. 26 points scored against the Ravens last week, and Davante Adams was taking it back to 2018 last week. He played a very good game. Gardner Minshew was really trusting him in this offense. He's still an alpha. This Raiders offense isn't the complete train wreck I cited coming into the year. And I think for the time being, Davante Adams has to be treated like a top 15 receiver. Wide receiver 15 is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. 22.5 implied Seahawks points at home against the Miami Dolphins. The only potential issue would be him facing Jalen Ramsey in this game. However, I am so bought in on this Seahawks passing offense. What I've seen in terms of the play sequencing with Ryan Grubb, being able to win on the outside like DK Metcalf showed last week, the explosive nature of this offense, and on top of that, Geno Smith returning to 2022 form. I understand it's risky knowing that he should face a lot of Jalen Ramsey in this game, but I trust this offense to the point where I'm not sitting the 6'4", 215-pound 4-3 receiver in an offense I think can score 25, 28 plus points on any given week. Again, more of a volatile play, but DK is the type of wide receiver that has a top 5 level upside that you simply aren't really getting in this range. Wide receiver 16 is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, 21 implied Bears points on the road against the Colts this week. Honestly, this is just the process play. Like, the Bears offense is really hard to trust at this point, but like I mentioned at the top of the video, Rome Odunze, despite playing 96% of the routes, still listed as questionable with that knee injury. Keenan Allen already expected out of this game, and although the Bears offense hasn't been clicking yet, it was a rookie generational quarterback in his first 2 NFL games. They played 2 tough defenses with the Titans and with the Texans in the first 2 weeks, and I do think that will correct itself going against a Colts defense that has really seeded big plays in the first 2 weeks of the year. DJ Moore, 11 targets last week. We want to be trusting that volume. My wide receiver 17 this week is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 23.75 implied Bucs points at home against the Broncos this week. And I do have Chris Godwin straight up ranked higher than Mike Evans this week. Chris Godwin obviously being in my top 12. Mike Evans more so a mid-range wide receiver 2. I think he's got the talent. I think he's got the big play upside to make me look foolish for having him here. But the issue that I have is that Patrick Surtain has shown himself to be the best cornerback in the NFL in the first 2 weeks. The numbers that he has done on both DK Metcalf and George Pickens in the first 2 games really makes me scared for the outlook of Mike Evans. Similar archetype wide receiver, big, 6'3" plus, 200 plus pound X receiver. Pat Surtain has seemingly had no trouble with. So again, Evans is a different breed. I think he's talented enough to just flat out win on his routes, but it's me being cautious and giving respect to how good Pat Surtain actually is. My wide receiver 18 this week is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, 24.5 implied Ravens points this week on the road against the Dallas Cowboys, which is pretty crazy. Again, they're 1-point favorites on the road against the Cowboys. I'm just saying, I think we're going to be able to bounce back after that drubbing against the Saints, but I digress. When it comes to Zay Flowers, this is the situation that you want to be betting on. High implied over-under in this game, 48 implied over-under. The Ravens are implied for over 24 points, and Zay Flowers is the focal point of this passing attack. Again, we saw a little bit more of a Mickey Mouse type of usage in week 1, around the line of scrimmage, yards after catch ability. We actually did see him being used down the field in week 2. I think that's going to be the case moving forward as they trust their offensive line, as their offensive line gets healthier, gets more continuity going into the year. We could see more, play action shots, develop shots down the field for Zay Flowers, which we didn't see in week 1. We saw it in week 2. So again, although I do think that the sportsbooks are kind of discrediting the Cowboys here, I think this is going to be a very high scoring game environment, and I want pieces of this game. Drake London comes in at wide receiver 19, hosting the Kansas City Chiefs this week. He caught a touchdown at the end of the Monday Night Football game against the Philadelphia Eagles. That comeback win, down 6. He scores the game-winning touchdown to win by 1. It really salvaged his fantasy day, but that drive really showed me a lot of upside for this offense moving forward. Kind of seemed like in the first, 7 quarters of NFL football, the Falcons' offense was really timid. Cousins didn't really trust his lower body, wasn't willing to stand in the pocket, deliver some shots down the field, and we saw that on that game-winning drive. So again, the upside for London moving forward, I think, is really high. Hopefully, we can see some more continuity in this offense in a matchup against the Chiefs, where if they are not able to put up points, they will get blown out in. So I do think we could see a nice script for Drake London to potentially score some fantasy points. My wide receivers 20 and 22, respectively, are Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans and Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. I already mentioned the matchup, going to play that ferocious Vikings defense this week. This is a tough matchup going up against the Vikings defense, but the Texans offense is one of the few offenses that I trust on a week-to-week basis, regardless of the matchup they're playing against. Not to mention, knowing that this is going to be a blitz-happy unit for the Vikings, I expect the first read share for Stephon Diggs coming out of the slot to be higher than the play-action shot guy like Tank Dell represents in this game. Again, if the Vikings are going to come out blitz-happy, I can see a lot of, designed yards after catch type of work for Stephon Diggs in this game. Tank Dell could very well get that as well, but based on the usage we've seen thus far, Stephon Diggs has been the main slot receiver, and the difference in air yard percentage between Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs has been huge. So I think they've kind of figured out their role. Stephon Diggs being that intermediate yak guy out of the slot, Tank Dell being their play action deep threat, and of course Nico Collins being the number 1. And then Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins and Jackson Smith and Jigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Like I already mentioned, big-time matchup this week. 18.5 implied Dolphins points, 22.5 implied Seahawks points, being 4-point home favorites. With Jalen Waddle, like I mentioned with Tyreek Hill, I don't have the same amount of confidence in terms of the overall talent being able to carry over because, Tyreek Hill, as good as Jalen Waddle is, Tyreek Hill is just in a different stratosphere of talent to be able to make up for the lack of quarterback play. Whereas with Jalen Waddle, again, as much as I think he's a top 12, top 15 level real-life talent, there's levels to this shit. And with Jalen Waddle, if they're going to be struggling on offense, especially throwing the football down the field with Skylar Thompson, I'm a lot more concerned about Jalen Waddle than I am with Tyreek Hill in this offense. With Jackson Smith and Jigba, he had his big-time breakout performance, 16 targets, over 10 receptions, over 100 receiving yards. I expect that to continue moving forward. Like I mentioned with DK Metcalf, he should face a lot of time on the outside against Jalen Ramsey. I can see Jackson Smith and Jigba working in the slot, getting a ton of volume in this game. And then Brian Thomas of the Jacksonville Jaguars comes in Richardson is my wide receiver 24, 20 implied Jaguars points this week. Honestly, this is just trusting the talent level. Brian Thomas has looked phenomenal in the first 2 weeks. I get it. The Jaguars passing offense hasn't really clicked so far to start the season, but I trust Trevor Lawrence to be able to figure it out. I trust Brian Thomas as the wide receiver 1 on this team to be able to give you that downfield ability while also developing into a true 3-level threat. I think there's a real possibility based off the talent level of Brian Thomas Jr. and the talent level of Trevor Lawrence that we should be talking about Brian Thomas as a wide receiver 2 moving forward. But moving on to my wide receiver 3s, I start off with Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions, 27.25 implied Lions points like I mentioned at the top. Jameson Williams is somebody that I can just flat out eat crow about so far this year. This is a guy that I was a little bit cautious on drafting coming into the season, a guy that I didn't want to spend on underdog a 7th, 8th, 9th round pick on because I thought he was overinflated based on what we've seen from him in the past. I was dead wrong. I mean, the usage he has in this offense, the player himself looks much better. There's a real possibility where after this week, even wide receiver 25 looks disrespectful. There's an opportunity against that Cardinals defense with a high over-under set game that Jameson Williams goes out there and has 6 catches, 123 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and he is considered a locked-in top 24 guy moving forward. Again, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious here. I still think in terms of the target hierarchy of this offense, you still have Amon-Ra St. Brown, you still have Sam Laporta, of course, Jameson Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs, to the point where I want to at least see one more week. I want to see what does it look like when Sam Laporta has a big game. What does it look like with Amon-Ra St. Brown having a big game, Jahmyr Gibbs having a big game in terms of Jameson Williams' workload? If he's able to show that he can overcome that and still be a consistent week-to-week option in this offense, he has to be viewed as a wide receiver 2. And the same thing applies to Rashid Shaheed, to be honest. Wide receiver 26 for me going into this week. Obviously, like I said, at home, 26 implied points. Saints offense has looked phenomenal. Clint Kubiak might just very well be the next head coach in the NFL. He looks great. He's bringing that Shanahan scheme over. And Rashid Shaheed has been an absolute monster to start the year. Over 2 yards per route run, looking efficient, commanding targets. I mean, he's caught in 2 big, 60-plus yard touchdowns in the first 2 weeks of the year. If he keeps doing what he's doing, like I said with Jameson Williams, there's a real possibility we could be talking about him as a wide receiver 2 moving forward. Again, small sample size. I want to at least see it one more week before I prop both him and Jameson into my top 24, but like them and like Brian Thomas Jr., they are on the fast trajectory to be able to do so. Wide receiver 27 is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and honestly, this case for me is just, I think he's taken a step as a player. 26% target share so far this year, 50% air yard share for the Steelers offense. I understand this is not a great offense. Only 18.75 implied points at home. Justin Fields throwing the rock. It isn't really clean. However, I'm willing to bet on the George Pickens bounce back. Obviously, he got the Pat Surtain treatment last week. I do think going into this week, going up against the Chargers, we can see a big-time bounce back performance. 6 catches for 85 yards in week 1. I see that potentially happening, if not even scoring a touchdown this week, going up against the Chargers. And what's a sneaky, really good game this weekend? Wide receiver 28 is Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts, 22.5 implied Colts points this week at home against the Bears. He's been an alpha-level target earner, but the problem with Michael Pittman is that the way he wins, the big possession receiver, consistent chain mover, it's just simply not the identity of this passing offense at this point. Anthony Richardson, as much as I love him, he's not going to go out there, complete 30 of 37 passes and dice a defense up 10 yards by 10 yards by 10 yards. The way Anthony Richardson will beat you in the passing game is by completing 13 of his 25 passes, but 5 of them are 30-plus air yards to A.D. Mitchell and Alec Pierce down the field. The thing with Michael Pittman Jr., again, I love him. I think he, in a different situation with a more accurate, chain-moving quarterback, could be a, wide receiver 2, top 15, 18 wide receiver, but given the context of this offense, I'm extremely concerned with Michael Pittman's role in it. A.D. Mitchell, Alec Pierce affecting the third level of the field. Not much left on the table for Michael Pittman. On top of that, Josh Downs expected back this week. I'm really just concerned about Michael Pittman. I want to at least see one big-time bounce-back week before he enters back into my top 25. And speaking of bounce-back weeks, we're going to need to see one from Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs, 25 implied points for the Chiefs this week. Obviously, we saw the highs in week 1, 2 touchdowns in his first 3 touches in the NFL, looking efficient, looking good. The big play nature he brings to this Chiefs offense. And we saw the floor, of course, this past week. I think we're going to start to see, bounces between those type of performances for Worthy. So for me, although he is a lot more volatile than some of the receivers in this range, the fact that he's attached to Patrick Mahomes, the fact that he's in an explosive, downfield offense, especially without Isaiah Pacheco being on the field, like I mentioned with Rashee Rice, only 27 pass attempts per game for the Chiefs thus far. I expect it to go up. I expect their big play first-round wide receiver, especially in the absence of Hollywood Brown, to be able to affect the game in multiple levels, whether it's in the yak game, around the line of scrimmage, like that end around we saw in week 1, or whether it's working down the field and burning somebody for a 70-yard touchdown. Worthy's got that type of upside on any given week, and although the volume isn't there yet, I think the big play nature alone makes him a top 30 play. Moving on to wide receiver 30, we have Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. Titans hosting the Green Bay Packers in this game, 20.25 implied Titans points. And with Calvin Ridley, obviously had his smash game last week, and he has another smash matchup against a top 5 team on the matchup chart against opposing passing offenses with the Green Bay Packers. But with Calvin Ridley, the thing I am a little bit concerned about is how does his role look with DeAndre Hopkins on the field? DeAndre Hopkins has been a limited player in his first 2 games, and by all accounts, according to Brian Callahan and Hopkins himself, it does sound like Hopkins is going to have a further step in this offense, potentially becoming a full-time player. Can Calvin Ridley still be that dominant, alpha-level target commander with DeAndre Hopkins on the field? That's why I have him at 30. I think you can make the case if we knew DeAndre Hopkins was only playing 60% of the snaps to have Calvin Ridley as a fringe top 24 wide receiver. But with the potential risk that DeAndre Hopkins gets back up to 75, 80+% of the routes, I have him here at 30. And then speed running through my flex plays, Amari Cooper comes in at 31 of the Cleveland Browns. On one hand, he's played so bad in the first 2 weeks and the offense looks horrific. But on the other hand, he's a dominant alpha level target commander in this offense that in any other circumstances would warrant a top 24 level placement. So with Amari Cooper, I don't know how to treat this because he demands a lot of targets, but he hasn't been playing well, and this Browns offense just simply hasn't looked good. And this is a potential bounce back spot going up against a struggling Giants defense, but to me, until I at least see Amari Cooper and this Browns passing offense really take that next step, I simply can't start him in my lineup over the other guys I have inside my top 30. 32, Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers, and this is fully a play on potentially Andy Dalton adding validity to this offense. Bryce Young has struggled. He's been a sack eater so far in the first 2 games. Obviously, they benched their first overall pick after less than 2 years starting. That's a good hint on how Bryce Young has really been developing this year. I'm sure there was stuff going on in the locker room. Now Andy Dalton's out there. Receivers probably happy. Andy Dalton being a floor raiser of this offense. I understand Deontay Johnson is not what you drafted him to be at this point, but I do think that this is a potential bounce back spot against the Raiders. Again, Andy Dalton has been a good floor raiser for the offense, and Deontay Johnson is the type of intermediate target, high volume target that Andy Dalton would really liken to. Wide receivers 33 and 36 respectively are Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills and Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills, hosting the Jacksonville Jaguars, 25.5 implied Bills points this week. On one hand, with Khalil Shakir, I feel a little more safer with him. He looks good. He's getting slot usage. He's getting more involvement on a week-to-week basis to the point where if I'm in a PPR league and I need someone in my flex spot to start this week, I think Khalil Shakir has a higher floor than Keon Coleman. However, with Keon Coleman, if you need upside, he is the absolute answer. In week 1, caught 4 of his 5 targets, 51 receiving yards, looked good, functioned well. And then in week 2, he got goose-egged by one of the best corners in the league. And I think that's going to be the Keon Coleman experience. I do think, however, when the Bills do start throwing the football more, we could see more volume in this offense for these wide receivers. Keon Coleman, again, I don't think he's going to go with a goose egg every week, but I think that kind of epitomizes the type of receiver you're getting. I think there's still weeks where you will have an extremely high upside, but the problem, of course, is because he's a very raw technical route runner at this point, he could flat out get shouted out of matchups like he was last week. Wide receiver 34, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, and he has an alpha level target share, but it is a very vanilla offense with Cliff Kingsbury calling the shots, and their biggest source of offensive production thus far has been through Daniels' legs. And Hayden Winks of Underdog actually tweeted this out, but if you're wondering why the Commanders receivers aren't getting the rock, look no further than a league low 29% target rate when Daniels faces pressure. League average is 60%. Meaning that when Daniels is scrambling, when Daniels is trying to make plays out of structure, only 29% of the time he's actually throwing the ball to his wide receivers. Less than half of the league average. So with Terry McLaurin, again, from a structure standpoint, I have concerns with Cliff Kingsbury. And from an out of structure standpoint, I have worries with Jaden Daniels simply getting him the football. So again, the target share would dictate he should be a top 30 wide receiver, but I have no trust in his role in this offense. And then finally, Ladd McConkey comes in at wide receiver 35 of the LA Chargers. Low implied total this week at 17.25. But with Ladd McConkey, I do trust Joey Porter Jr. to spend the majority of his snaps on the outside going up against Josh Palmer or Quentin Johnson in this game. And I do expect a ton of production underneath for Ladd McConkey coming out of the slot. Nearly 2/3 of his snaps so far on the year has come out of the slot. The only issue, the only caveat I have at this point is apparently Justin Herbert is questionable. If Justin Herbert is out of this game, I do view Ladd McConkey more so in the wide receiver 45, 50 plus range rather than a top 35, 40 receiver. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like, comment down below your biggest start sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And of course, like I mentioned in the middle of the video, 2 ways to get access to our weekly rankings manifesto. Underdog Fantasy, promo code FSC, sign up and first deposit $10+. You will get access to that manifesto, as well as over on flockfantasy.com, promo code FSC for 30% off any package on the site, as well as a 7-day free trial over on the site. So the 2 ways to get our rankings, you guys are going to want them. You guys are going to need them coming into the season. We have the most resourceful tools for you guys to dominate your fantasy football matchups. But with that being said, peace out. Let's win this week. Let's win week 3. I'm 2-0 in the Flock League. We're hoping to get to 3-0 and keep that undefeated streak going, baby. Take care.